Today we will have today's sort of structure will work pretty much the same as yesterday. So we will have two lectures now. It's my turn to talk about sort of things, and then in the afternoon we will have a tutorial when we will more or less replicate the stuff which I'm going to be talking about, in particular in the first lecture. So all the wave to X and those type of things. We also have results of our own analysis of our own recordings. I will even sort of show you a spoiler. Of course, same as yesterday, we will run in the afternoon in the tutorial some codes in the Jupyter notebook, the same as yesterday, which means that you will then have access to the codes for the future, and you can play with the things later on. If you have your own data, you can try them on and all that. There's going to be one caveat, but we'll talk about it later, that as currently we don't have the Jupyter way implemented the actually extractions of the latent vectors. That's because those things actually have to run on a GPU, so as opposed to CPU. We don't want to overload Google by 50 people running the same code. So not that Google is particularly sensitive, but we will also share that type of that portion of the code later on in some sort of GitHub repository where everything is going to be ready. So I just want to mention that, so to keep in mind that when you don't understand something or you are curious about how something will be working, you will have your chance to try it for yourself. Tomorrow we can actually discuss, and we will discuss what type of research actually you might be doing, what you might want to do, and how you might want to apply these type of techniques and technologies for your own research. So yes, today I'm going to be talking about these machine learning, deep learning approaches in two sort of sections. First one, I'm going to be talking exactly about this wave to wake, about these little bit black boxy things, where we cannot really pinpoint definitely whether what we are capturing, whether we are capturing phonetic, phonotactical, morphological, or prosodic relationships among the different dialects or languages or whatever we are comparing. So I'm just sort of, let's imagine we are looking at sort of phonetic in general. Phonetic sort of subsums prosodic. Prosody is part of whatever there is in a signal and whatever people are talking about. One way or the other, this is the way how to quantify and bring forth and analyze linguistic diversity. We are comparing. Comparing means that we are assuming that some underlying characteristics of the different groups of signal and all that are different. There is some source of some variance, source of which we are trying to capture. So we are essentially looking at diversity. We are analyzing and quantifying diversity. We are not hand-waving things that saying like, oh, this is diverse. But we are trying to actually establish that these things are a little bit more similar, and in this direction there is more, quantifiable way, more diversity. And in this direction, perhaps the things are more related to each other. So this is this kind of quantifiable and what is the word? Sort of computational way, essentially, one of many, how to assess and evaluate the linguistic diversity. So today I'm going to be sort of first bringing, actually I copied some slides from the day before yesterday about wave to vec. By the way, I think Priyanku told me that in one of my slides I misspelled this wave to I don't remember. Sometimes, for some reason, of course, in my mother tongue we don't have the approximant w. So I always have to think when I even sort of try to write a file name and to add the end, I always have to think whether it's wave or wave. For me, it's not natively contrastive, so yeah, so I use relatively randomly all sort of spellings. So when I haven't tried to invent the new type of format, which would be VAW or something like that, or WAW. All of them are equivalent for me. They are sort of allophonic to my ear and my brain. Then we sort of try to figure out how we actually, I've showed you some of those results of the analysis. So we are going to go step by step of how we get them. So we are going to think about how to create the utterance level latent representations. And latent representations mean that they are essentially mappings of some object to this very multidimensional numeric space in format of the vector. The mapping is driven by the structure driven by exactly similarities and differences between whatever we are mapping into the latent space. So it's not random, but the precise details how this mapping works, because it's driven by machine learning approach. It's sort of utilitarian mapping. It's mapping so that it works for whatever purpose we impose on the machine learning thing. Is a little bit opaque. We don't really know. We know that whatever the machine needs is there, but we don't necessarily know in what format. So we are going to talk about how can we obtain this utterance level representation, as opposed to sort of frame level representation. I'll talk about that in detail. And then I'm going to throw at you, this is implicit in the entire sort of lecture, sort of course, I guess, but I'm not sure whether I sort of spelled out the main hypothesis. Don't expect anything very deep, but that's actually something which is driving all of this type of diversity quantification research. And then we look at the language and dialect level latent representation. So we start from some small portion, utterance, and then how can we create the latent representation of a dialect or language. And then we look at some sort of visualization of capturing the relationships. So visualization of linguistic of quantified take on linguistic diversity, essentially. So this is the slide I copied from one of the previous talks. This is this architecture of the wave-to-vec. You don't have to worry about how it works, really. We know that precisely this is a picture drawn sort of bottom up, essentially. So this is input, this is output to the trained wave-to-vec network. So you feed some waveform, you analyze bit by bit pieces of the network. You take, depending on the setting, these are relatively small pieces, if I remember, like 25 milliseconds or so. And then you summarize using some convolutional networks, some network architecture, which can sort of find the characteristics, in particular of the sort of signal moving continuous signal. You summarize them in some latent representations, and then you train the thing so that you can predict. You hide one of those latent representation for some particular portion, and you make sure that the network can sort of predict, can use the other representation from the surrounding material, from the surrounding portion of the signal, and predict what's actually missing, what would be hidden from that. Mm-hmm. There is also this, for some people who are sort of interested in that, there is this contrastive loss element in that. That actually, because if you think about that, because this machine, this network learns those representations and then predicts the same representations. So in theory, what could the network learn if we kind of were naively just sort of wanted to predict? It would just learn to predict, for example, zeros, and we hide them from whatever we feed it, it would predict zeros. And then, we would hide one vector of zeros and ask, can you predict the vector of zeros from the other vectors of zeros? And the network would say, sure, I can, That's easy. So it's not that simple. What you rather ask the network is you pick the candidate, you give it the candidate from the surrounding signal, and he has to be able to say, this is not this, not this, not this, not this, yes, this. So that, of course, beats that zero idea, because it has to say, oh, these are not these zeros, not the zeros, yes, so that wouldn't work. So that's why it has to contrastively pick. For each portion, it has to be different than the other portions. And not only the representativeness of the latent representation of the given portion of the signal is what counts, but also that it's different from the others. So that's how it really works, But this is, this is a well-established technique. You can, look it up You can read papers on that. There's many papers on that. This is a very, very important part of machine learning technology. I'm sure you can ask ChatGPT and it will explain reliably and in some sort of detail how this works. That's how much material is actually, much discussion is about this technique around. So, yeah, this is, I guess, this is again a copy from my own lecture. So with the pre-trained Web-to-Vec network transfer speech signal to sequence of latent representations. The latent representation encode contextual information, and they can be then used. This is so-called foundational model. So this is a self-supervised model. You don't give it any task. The only task which it needs to do is to represent it so that it's in a context-dependent way. But you don't say that, well, I actually need this for speech recognition or speech synthesis or language identification. This is called foundational model, which just is created. It doesn't know what we want it for. The only thing it knows is that it has to create a representation which characterizes the portion of that and is different from the others, from the neighboring ones, right? So we know that it captures all sort of interesting characteristics. By the way, when I talk about these vectors, they are really big. I don't remember what is in this particular XLS. XLS are actually the particular flavor of the Web2Vec. What are they? 2048, I think, dimensional of those vectors. So we're not talking about 3 numbers. We are talking about a lot of numbers. We represent each of these little portions. Now, so how can we? So we get from now I turn it upside down. As a matter of fact. How can we, so there's a signal and these are those little convolutional things which actually, they actually do the coding bit. So, you know, we get for each speech signal, is some sort of utterance, we get a sequence of these representations. So how can we get the representation for the utterance level? We want one code, one vector for the entire utterance. So what we do is sort of, we create another type of network of some sort, which summarizes these things and maps all this entire sequence to one vector. To one vector. So there is a single vector, latent, again, sort of with the hidden properties for us necessary, representation of the entire utterance. So this is done by the technique called attention pooling. Don't worry about it, I'll unpack it a little bit. The important thing is that this summarization is done in the way which is useful for the task we want to do. You can have many different summarizations of the utterance. You might want to summarize the utterance for in order to do some speaker identification thing, So then this particular network would learn to pick all sort of important things from these latent representations, the sequence, which are important for identifying a speaker, for some forensic task. Or you might want to do some, want to build some noise cancelling, headphones or something, noise cancelling technology. So you might pick all of the things which, all of the information which this sequence of vectors contain, which is relevant to assess the amount of noise, or even sort of separate the signal from the noise, as it were. Anything we can do. So this is already sort of task-oriented sort of architecture. So this is another slide I copied from somewhere. I'll come back to that in a second. We are talking about this language identification task. So this is some sort of, again, black boxy network which acts as a language identification network. It's a classifier. Classifier of the sort Priyanka was talking about. This is one of those machine learning based classifier. Very powerful classifier. The idea is that you feed it some sort of utterance, run it through the network, this sequence of numbers, all good, network, and it gives you the probability, let's say, of the language from which it thinks that particular utterance comes. So, so this is English one, and this particular cell here, these are just a bunch of numbers. You know, if you feed it some other utterance, it would give high probability, you know, whatever it thinks the corresponding language actually is. So if we look a little bit inside how it works, the language identification, they actually often, nowadays the modern ones, so the ones we were looking at, they actually, rather than receiving the raw waveform, they actually receive the sequence of the latent representation from way to back, already sort of pre-processed signal, and then they put some attention layer. Attention layers, for those who, many of you know what it is, who you don't know, it's a super powerful and very, very simple technique, which essentially learns for the given signal what portions of the signal are important for the given task. So it learns where to look. So because this is going to be, the target of this is to identify the language, so it will automatically, this is all trained, it will learn to extract where should I look, you know, what part of features I should look at. And then it sort of whatever the attention layer spits out, it sort of goes through several other whatever processing layers. I think this, if I remember well, this is kind of correct. I just copied it from the paper more or less, but it can be any type of architecture. By the way, if you're interested, the attention layer is a core part of slightly bigger machine learning sort of block, which is called transformer. It's a core part of transformer. Transformer is essentially just attention layer wrapped within two other type of layers, convolutional or dense layers. Doesn't really matter. But again, you know, a transformer is what is it, the T in GPT. So this is a core technology, core architecture behind all of these massive large language models and all of these super successful applications which we are using now. Yeah. So now, importantly, you know, we feed a lot of hidden vectors, a lot of latent vectors, and here, after attention summarizes them, and from here on, oops, oh, now this beats me. From here on, we work on the sort of whatever prescribed size of the vector here is. So this is a sequence, and here we get a sort of single vector, a summary, a task-dependent summary of the sequence of vectors. That actually means, so these connections are passing a fixed length information. They are passing vectors for each utterance, a vector, a long vector. Again, 2000 dimensional, 1000 dimensional, whatever. Importantly, they are fixed length. Whatever input length is, these are fixed length. So we can actually pick one up and take that as a representation of the utterance. This is a fixed length thing. By the way, here is a softmax layer. Softmax layer is something which again is trained to translate some particular latent representation to this vector of probabilities. It's some particular thing which essentially it's a vector. It's a normal deep learning layer. The only thing is that essentially the output sums to 1 and is all positive. So that means that, you know, you can interpret the output as a vector of probabilities. And again, each of the sort of cells in that vector is then correspond, for example, to one language. So there could be a probability that this given utterance comes from that language and not the other. But what's important for us, so here at this point, the network has generated all the information which are available for the language identifier to make that decision in the last layer, as it were. So we can assume that after several layers of processing, this is the representation which contains all the information relevant for language identification, as extracted by this machine learning thing. So that's why we can use that as the vector to represent the entire utterance. So I just sort of lumped it here, just turned it around, put it here. This is the attention layer fully connected, and this is I chopped that last softmax off. So now I can feed the signal, run it through the wave to vec sequence of representations, and then extract all the information in a finite length form, all the latent information which is trained to be relevant for language identification. So we come from input speech signal to a single representation, single vector representation of the vector, of the signal. These, luckily for us, we don't have to worry about training these things. We can just plop them from some GitHub somewhere, because these have been trained by other people. And they've been trained on a vast amount of linguistic and speech material. So at least the original sort of wave-to-vec thing, XLSR is the name of that particular wave-to-vec implementation, has been trained on, 436,000 hours of speech. I would say by now it's probably trained on more than that, or and from very many languages. Well, not that very many, but from a substantial amount of languages of hopefully reasonable diversity. We will talk about these particular things tomorrow. And then the other part, which processes these wave-to-vec things and sort of uses them for the language identification task, was also pre-trained by actually our colleagues from Tallinn. Tallinn is just across the water from Helsinki. Again, it was trained on, did I miss that? Oh yeah, on a speech data from over 107 languages. So they were, doing this, the final, I think 107, the final vector had 107 points. So, the network was trained to distinguish 107 languages. Importantly, it learned to distinguish those languages, and not the others. But we assume, and our sort of results show that our assumption is correct, that it can be still used to extract characteristics from also from the language which were not used in the training. So we learned something a little bit more broad about how languages are related to each other and similar to each other. So the latent fixed length vector contain, in a numerical form, remember, I'm a mathematician, I'm happy when I have numbers, all information which can be used for language identification. It probably contains, almost certainly contains, all sort of phonetic, phonotactic, spectral information about the signal. Not necessarily detailed phonetic, phonotactic information. Not necessarily the thing that, some sort of form and values for entire vowel space of the given language, but some sort of characteristics, in complicatedly, presumably encoded spectral characteristics of the signal, which are relevant for language identification. So maybe, if there are, for example, if there are some languages characterized by sort of retroflexes, so it probably keeps some knowledge about that. That there is some retroflex would leave some acoustic mark. So because the retroflex might be useful, presence or absence of retroflex might be useful for identifying the language. Therefore, it will probably represent that watermark which retroflex leaves in a signal in some way or the other. It very likely contains sort of rhythmic characteristics of the language, because those are easily discernible from the signal, relatively easily discernible from the signal, and they are very useful for identifying languages. It almost certainly captures some overall intonational patterns, because again, those things are kind of robustly, as we were trying to show on the first day, relatively robustly presented in a signal, because they come from the voice source, so they leave the mark, and they are, as we know, very useful for distinguishing among the languages. But of course, we don't really know precisely. We don't know exactly what it contains, and we don't know how it's encoded there. So it's a little bit of a black boxy thing. But we can be confident that all of this information is somehow stored in the latent vector. So we will have time for comments later. I'm not 100% sure how long this lecture will go. I have two of them, so I don't know. We might, between them, they should cover just about the right amount of 3 hours. So
I think there was one slide, if you go back, where you talked about the fixed length.
Please?
Yeah. The prior to that, like maybe before that, another one. Yeah. So this one, if you can just I can simplify it a little bit. I mean, that would be good.
Okay. Excellent. So once again, when what wave-to-vec technique generates is a sequence of vectors and a sequence of the length. Well, the vectors have some particular fixed length, but there can be 30 vectors, there can be 300 vectors, depending on how long the speech signal is. It's a kind of windowing. We are going with the magnifying glass through the signal, and if the signal is long, we need to have many. We obtain very many vectors. If the signal is short, we obtain few vectors. This is not very good for comparing the different type of signals, because we cannot compare easily 50 vectors with 500 vectors. What we can easily do in a vector arithmetics is to compare two vectors, however long they are, but they should be from the same space. Same space meaning they should have the same dimensionality. They could be both 512 dimensional, as opposed, then it's fine. If one is 512 dimensional, one is 7,000 dimensional, it's difficult to compare them. So this entire thing, this entire sort of, it's called fine-tuning of the foundational model, is used among other things. Well, this fine-tuning was used for language identification task, but we use it to summarize the bunch of vectors which come from the signal in one vector of the same length for each signal, regardless how long the signal is. And it's done, the summarization is done by the attention layer. We don't have to worry how it works, but it's done by the attention layer, which sort of is trained to know where to look. And this is the summarizer, essentially. This is the thing which summarizes the sequence of vector into one vector in the manner which is relevant for its task, which is to spot differences among the languages. And then we don't have to worry that there are some processing steps here. These are processing steps which already are performed on the finite, on a fixed length of the vector. I don't remember Tukam, I remember this is, I think this fits like 2048. Usually they kind of get a little bit shrinking. Yeah, this is 512, this is for 2048, and this probably is half of that, so it kind of halves it, usually. As you know, there is no particular reason for that, but because this is all built by the IT nerds, so all the sizes are sort of the power of 2, So nobody would make the 1,000-dimensional network, 1,000-dimensional vector. There has to be 1,024. No particular reason for that, as a matter of fact. But that's how it is. And that way we can actually take any signal in of whatever length and obtain a vector representation of the given fixed length. As Tuka said, I think what we extracted is 512-dimensional vector. So however long signal we get 512 numbers at the end of that. And those numbers, between them, contain all the information network learned to identify as relevant for language identification. So when we have a database like this, so let's imagine this is database like Assamese database I think we were talking about earlier, Assamese dialect database. This is going to be cartoon pictures. I will, every now and then I point when I'm violating some sort of geometry, as a matter of fact. This is a difficult one. The 512-dimensional vectors, it's very difficult to imagine 512-dimensional space, and that's not possible to plot. So, but let's imagine, and these are some recordings, and the color of those recordings corresponds to a dialect or whatever, or location. So we have them somehow, the orange and the green and that sort of blues. We should have picked some more basic colors, because my color naming in English is actually really relatively poor. I'm constantly arguing with my daughters and my wife, who is an artist, when I talk about like, what about that, whatever, do you see that car in that particular color, and they're looking, and it's like, that's completely wrong color, what I'm not colorblind, but my naming, the mapping is not working. So yeah, so now when we have the database like that, now we have a technique how we can translate all of these recordings to the bunch of vectors of the same length, right? And again, we keep the coloring. We remember from what in our metadata, as a matter of fact, we need to where each of these vectors came from. The main idea and hypothesis behind all of this exercise is this. The more similar the recordings in some particular aspect, the more similar the numerical representations they are, and vice versa. So now we quantified linguistic diversity, or phonetic or prosodic diversity. Without this type of an approach, we can say, oh, these things are somewhat more similar, and these things is very different. You know, this is language from the Maya language from Central America. So this, and we can hear that it's very different. It's very diverse. This way we can quantify it. We can put a number on the differences and the distances between things. In this particular case, because the latent representations, as we were talking until now, are fine-tuned for language or potentially maybe dialect. We know that they work on dialect identification. The similarity among those vectors maybe corresponds to the language dialect similarity among the recordings. If we use the latent representations, which were trained for, let's say, speaker identification, then we would know that the similarity among those latent representations is probably linked to similarity among the speakers. So the more similar voice of the speakers, the numerically closer those vectors would be. The more different voice, presumably numerically more different those vectors would be, right? Because we trained it for language identification, presumably for language identification, the speaker information is not so important. So presumably, to a large extent, the machine learning tries to wipe that out. It doesn't really care whether it's a young boy or middle-aged woman or somebody with any type of potential even speech impairment. It tries to only suck out or represent the characteristics which are relevant for differences among the languages. So now, using this type of representation, we would hope that the more similar the vectors are, more similar the languages from which these vectors, or dialects from which vectors actually come. Why we are so ecstatic about having things in the vector representation? First of all, because mathematicians, and second, because we can actually do all sort of meaningful operations on the vectors. You can, for example, calculate the distance between the vectors. I'm not going to go to the... This is an example from one of the previous slides as well. You learned at school, how to calculate the distance between 2 points. This is a Pythagoras theorem, it's this is a right angle triangle. So this is the one line. We know how long is this because it's this minus this. We know how long is this because it's this minus this, right? And therefore we can calculate the length of that third thing, which I know there is English name, but because I studied math in Slovak, I have no clue what they call it. So in this particular case, the distance between these two-dimensional vectors would be roughly 5.83 units, whatever the unit here is. And this can be generalized to multiple dimensions. So this is not the only way how to measure distance. There are many ways how to measure distance, and we can sort of pick freely whichever actually suits our purposes best. In fact, for I think most of our applications, we use a so-called cosine distance, which is recommended for as a measure of distance on a very multidimensional spaces, rather than this what is called Euclidean distance. And, see the pattern. Euclides was all ancient Greek. Pythagoras was ancient Greek. Yeah, so it comes from that. I'm sure it probably doesn't come from that part of the world. It probably comes from this part of the world, but they kind of copied that and presented to the Europeans. And then the cosine distance is a distance it's a distance like when you are looking at the starry sky, and you see the distances between the stars. Can you measure distances, angular distances that were between them? Of course, we know that some of them are vastly far away and some of them are vastly a little bit closer. You know, they're all vastly far, but some of them are more vastly far than the others. But we ignore that distance. We are only looking at the distances that appear to us on the so we have all of those constellations. We know that some of those stars and constellations are bizarrely far from each other, but we see them as a lump. So that's the type of distance we use. We can use a lot of type of distances on the vectors. In general, we can do all sort of, most of the things which we can do with numbers, we can do with vectors. We can sort of like sum them. We can, subtract one from the other. We can multiply them. Let's not go there. That's slightly more complicated. We can take a square root of them. All sorts of things. Normally, as mathematicians, we very often just, as you know, we represent everything in variables, A, B, C's, rather than the 1, 2, 3's. And it's a good habit to put some sort of mark that this particular variable corresponds to the vector. But very often we sort of forget about that. And we do everyththing with them as numbers. So it's a good thing. We can do all sorts of things. For example, we can calculate the mean, an average of multiple vectors. You can calculate the average of numbers. You can calculate the average of vectors. In this case, again, this is two-dimensional, so the average is like this point. I calculated it for you, and it's sort of somewhere in the middle of them, right? A little bit closer to this lump because there are two here, like that. There is a little formula for these three vectors. Straightforward.
Is it Pythagorean?
Yeah, this is just a normal mean. Mm-hmm. Again, as Priyanko has sort of noted, we can do means. We can do all sort of other type of means than arithmetic mean with numbers. We can do geometric mean and whatever other types of means, harmonic mean and what have you. We can do all of those type of means with vectors as well. Essentially, almost everything we can do with numbers, we can do with vectors and plenty more. Sorry, this was the small mathematics. Now I'm satisfied. I've thrown in some math. We can go on. So now, when we show this database here, we have a one vector per utterance. But we want one vector per dialect or per language or whatever unit of linguistic diversity, as a matter of fact, we pick. So the simple idea is, well, just take the mean of them, right? So we have all of these. There are these sort of this type of blue vectors here. I a little bit sort of made them to fade away, and this is the mean of them. We just sort of sum them all and divide by number of things. Here is the brown one, the mean, the green mean, and all that. So we just take the mean of all of those vector utterance level vectors which represent the given language, and voila, you have the vector representing the language. It's crazy, no? 212 dimensional vector, 212 numbers. Oh, sorry, 512 numbers. It's quite a lot of numbers, but still representing a language. I got so used to that I didn't sort of really think much about that. But we were teaching with Tuka actually earlier this school year, the last semester. We're teaching the similar course in Finland, and there were some linguists in the audience. And when we got to roughly this point, one of them stood up and said, like, "What? One vector representing language? What do you mean by that?" I'm not going to unpack it to you more than I did, but just imagine that. It's crazy. Like of course, we have to then realize that, okay, of course, it doesn't represent the entire vocabulary of the language. It doesn't represent all structural characteristics of the language. It doesn't represent all the morphology or history or number of speakers or, diversity among the speakers and what have you. It represents the characteristics of the language which are present in a signal and are useful to distinguish from the others. That's what it does. That's why I'm going to be talking about this language representation, latent language representation. Take it with this pinch of salt. I'm not talking that now I put these 500 numbers in my some sort of back somewhere, and I go somewhere to the dark, quiet corner and reconstruct the entire language from those 512 things. That's not going to happen. But it is, to many uses and purposes, the vector representing the language or dialect.